All right, everyone, welcome back to the final segment of today's show where we talk a little bit about financial aid. And part of the reason that we're doing this now is because as the calendar flips from 2023 to 2024, families are starting to get admissions decisions back. And those decisions typically will include some sort of financial aid award. And typically, a key component of that award is going to be loans. Loans are a big part of how families pay for higher education these days. And we want to understand a little bit more, not just about what those loans are going to mean in the first year, but what's going to happen long term for families that choose to borrow in order to pay for education. So this is not something that I know anything about, which is why we've got Michelle Smoley, my colleague over in the college finance expert section, joining us for the show today. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Ian. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. It's nice to have you. So help me understand a little bit about what sort of brought forth this topic as something that we wanted to talk about for today. I know that there's just the natural cadence of the admissions and college finance cycle, but I think there's also something that you're noticing in terms of trends that might be relevant for families as they're thinking about borrowing.
Right. A lot of times, because we work with a lot of families on paying for college, but also repaying student loans. And in those student loan conversations, we are hearing from college graduates where parents maybe took out a bunch of federal student loans and now they're passing them along to their students. Or students are not able to buy a car or a home. They're foregoing those life changes like marriage and having children because of the student loan indebtedness. And a lot of times, this time of year, in our paying for college calls, we're hearing from families, if my child gets into A, B, or C school, I don't care what it costs, we'll borrow. They're going to go to that institution. But then we also work with the
Hmm.
students and the adults afterwards, and even some of the parents afterwards. And they're dealing with literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, especially if the parents are borrowing for multiple children.
Yeah.
And then these parents are foregoing retirement and having to pinch their pennies at an age where they really shouldn't be doing that from a financial perspective.
So it's interesting because we just spoke with in a great segment last segment about with a recruiter, and the first question that I asked her was, advice that you as a recruiter would give to yourself when you graduated from college. But this sounds like a circumstance where you're really able to give advice to people who are considering borrowing that is informed by people who have borrowed in the past. You're connecting the experience of those who are currently deep in student loan debt with the experience of those who right now are just saying it doesn't matter, we can sort of pay for whatever. So I like that. I think that that's a really great parallel element of the segment, and I think it also speaks to of course the volume of our experience here and the expertise that is developed as a result of that. Let's talk about student borrowers first. I
Sure.
think that that's probably a little bit more easy to understand, a little bit more close to home, right? Because the student is the one that's going to school, so they're the one doing the borrowing. So help me understand some of the major effects that student loan debt will have after a student graduates, after the grace period perhaps has passed and they start making those repayments. What are some of the effects that people maybe don't anticipate?
Sure. Undergraduate students can only borrow roughly 27 to $30,000 in the federal student loan program.
In total,
So,
not
in
per year, but in total.
as an undergraduate in the federal loan program.
Okay.
So, if you're looking at repayment on 30,000 in debt as an undergrad, your monthly payment is roughly going to be around $300 a month.
Okay.
That's not typically where the issue lies. The issue lies when students and parents borrow above and beyond those amounts, whether the student goes on to grad school and then the federal loan limits, quite honestly, there are none.
Yeah.
There are no aggregate student loan limits. They went away in 2013, I believe it was. There's also no borrowing limits from the federal perspective on the parent side. And a lot of times, what we're seeing now is parents who are borrowing the federal parent loan, some of them think it's their students or their child's loan, when in essence, it is
Mm,
not legally their debt. And we find that there are those family agreements where the parents are like, okay, I'm going to take on this additional $30,000, $40,000 a year in debt, but then when you graduate, you're going to have to repay that. So now the graduate isn't just repaying 30,000, they're repaying 150,000. I've talked to borrowers who have 200,000,
mm.
and that's just for an undergrad degree. Um, and all of us on the team have heard it multiple times through the years. I should have just went to
Yeah.
my 4-year in-state school, because they're not realizing the impact on their credit scores or their debt to income ratios that lenders will look at if they're trying to buy a car or a home, and those types of adult situations that come up financially afterwards.
And this is, conversation we have on the admission side is that's connected to this is often about feelings that there's a really divergent, real vast chasm in quality between those highly priced private schools and those public in-state universities. They're going to be much more affordable. They're still expensive, but they are more affordable. And the reality is that a really talented student who's got their ducks in a row can be in great shape at either of those institutions. And maybe for a particular family, it's not worth stretching yourself because of these later effects. And you might just be looking at the loans and saying, well, I can take out this much money, but what you're really putting your finger on is how down the road there are more long-term effects. One of the things that you shared with me was, a lot of students are moving back in with their parents, right? And so one question is, would you rather go to private university and live on your and move back in with your parents, or go to a public university and maybe live on your own? If you put it in those terms, maybe students are thinking about it a little differently.
And we do speak to borrowers who are in that scenario where they're like, I went to nursing school, I have my BSN, but I went to a private school. And now, because of my student loan debt, I moved back home so I can pay off these loans in 5 years or maybe 7 years instead of 10, 15, or 20.
Yeah. So what are we looking for if we're a student, right? How do we want to think about our debt versus, and this is something that I know I've heard from you and your team many, many times, but I want to make sure that our listeners hear it. What's a good measuring stick for how we should think about our debt when we graduate?
Sure. The rule of thumb really is a college graduate, regardless of whether it's undergrad or grad or professional school, they really should not be taking on more debt than what their beginning annual salary is starting in their given profession or field of study.
And
So,
yeah, and I would say, based on the conversation that we just had with the recruiter, I would think you want to be also a little conservative about what you anticipate your starting salary to be. Every student might say, I'm going to graduate, make $150,000 a year. Whether that is the reality, the recruiter was just speaking about how naive some students are about where they're going to be beginning within their particular career path. So be conservative in terms of your expectations there.
exactly.
Now, you also mentioned, and I think this is something that we don't often think about because student loans are something that I always think about, we attach to the student, these parent borrowing effects, right? There are these big effects that come later on. And it sounds like you're saying that the big issue is that there are not limits on what these loans look like. Is that right?
That is right. So if parents are looking at borrowing from the federal direct loan program, there is a parent loan that is called the PLUS loan. And PLUS is actually an acronym that stands for the Parent Loan for Undergraduate Students.
Okay.
And parents can borrow up to the cost of attendance each year, uh, subtracting any other financial aid that their student child receives that year. So we're seeing significantly higher borrowing on the federal Parent Plus side because there are no limits.
Hmm.
And then when you couple that with oftentimes families have more than one child, and obviously college is a multi-year experience. So I have recently spoken to a mom that has three children. One is finally in their senior year in college, and she has taken on over $300,000 in federal Parent Plus loans
Wow.
because she had three children.
Wow. That's always something that I've got two kids and they're very close in age, and something that we think about is okay, well, it's not just the tuition for one institution for one student. It's going to be simultaneous
Mhm.
for 3 years. They'll be overlapping, and it'll be a total of 5 years that we're paying, and so it's a pretty significant financial burden. And if you just look at that one loan amount that you get in the financial aid award, it looks a lot more reasonable. But when you start to see them stacking, you got to think about the whole picture, right?
Right, right. And because we kind of live in this buy now, pay later society, a lot of times it's, I'm just going to sign on the master promissory note, I'll deal with it later. But then at some point in time, you do have to deal with that debt. And then, if, for example, parents want to refinance their home, if they have an additional 150, 300,000 in Parent Plus loans, or they co-signed on private education loans for their children, that's included in their debt to income ratios and could affect the interest rate they get if they get approved for the loan. And so there's a lot of implications um, in relation to significant borrowing.
And just to reinforce that, a lot of, I think there can be this assumption that it's a loan that I took out for my student's education, and so it is a student debt, but in fact, it is a parent debt. And so that's something that affects my buying power as a parent, affects my ability to get a loan as well.
Right, right.
What are the current parent plus loan rates that we see?
Right now, for this upcoming academic year, they're a little over 8%,
Okay.
and they have a 4.23% origination fee.
Okay.
So we're the Parent Plus loans are always at a higher interest rate than the federal student loans. But again, the student loans have borrowing limits, and oftentimes parents are not paying the interest or paying the principal when the student is in school. So then you see multiple years of interest being capitalized. And that's where the loan balances can really start to get very significant.
So in terms of what parents should be thinking about, right? We got that guidance for students in what they
Mhm.
should be taking on, but how should parents be thinking about the loans that they're taking on, especially given that families can be, many students in size.
Right. Use some repayment calculators. I really can't stress that enough for families. Um, Typically, in the lending interest industry, most lenders are saying you don't want the student loan or the parent loan payments to be more than 10% of your discretionary income. So
Okay.
if so that's a good rule of thumb. And again, if you have multiple children, I'm not saying you have to borrow for all of them, but many families do tend to try and keep it equal. And so you do need to keep that into consideration since college is a multi-year expense.
Okay. So tonight at dinner, I'll be talking to my 11 and 9-year-old about scholarships and how to get scholarship. Thanks a lot, Michelle. I know this is a big puzzle, and I think higher education is important. That's why we have listeners. That's why we do the job that we do. But I think it's really important for people to understand, with the costs being what they are, how taking on these loans can have these ripple effects down the road. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Thanks a
Great.
lot.
Folks, we will be back again next week, continuing our shows for 2024. We've been doing this for a really long time now, and we're really glad to have you all aboard as regular listeners. Our show next week will focus on building a college list, the excitement that comes with a college visit, and we'll talk about the simplified FAFSA rollout, simplified in air quotes. We're going to see how that's going and hear from our friends in college finance. Until then, have a wonderful week, and we look forward to being with you again next week.